Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, October 3rd, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Utah as Democrats near a victory in the redistricting process in this state that's set to take place in just a few short days. October 6th is the deadline for Republicans to pick a brand new congressional map ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. It is Democrats who successfully made the case to the Utah Supreme Court, asking them to deny the maintenance of the Supreme Court, of the map here, rather, for the congressional elections in the 2026 midterms. And like I said, Democrats were successful in that regard, and now the Supreme Court, agreeing with the lower court's decision, is requiring a brand new map. And in this declaration, the courts all but said Democrats must have a safe district in the state of Utah to face in the 2026 midterms. They must be in a position where they are able to win one district there, ultimately almost every single cycle. Now, this whole thing was really a main issue because in 2018, Proposition 4 passed in the state of Utah that ultimately declared that by the time there was another redistricting cycle in the state, it would require a gerrymander to be gotten rid of, ultimately deciding that an independent commission would propose the maps and implement them in this state. But during the pandemic, the Utah Republican Party quietly pulled away some of the avenues that citizens had put forth in Proposition 4, ultimately repealing it and restoring that power to the state legislature. Republicans took advantage of that after the 2020 election, drew Utah into a complete and undeniable gerrymander, one that was so exceptionally difficult for Democrats to see any pathway to a singular victory in this state, and ultimately axed them out of power in Utah by every single metric. And it wasn't as if Democrats were in a strong position before. In 2020, Democrats held the same amount of seats that they hold today. But in 2018, it took a Democratic wave to get this far. Utah's 4th district went to Ben McAdams against Mia Love by a margin of 1/4 percentage point. Democrats came out strong and won one seat in Utah. But Republicans never wanted to face this again. So instead, they drew a map that was so lopsided in favor of the Republican Party that by 2024, not a singular district voted to the left of the state, ultimately showing the true strength of their gerrymander. But then Democrats got it struck down. I already told you how Proposition 4 was upheld by the Utah Supreme Court, so how are Democrats nearing a victory in Utah even more than what they might expect from the court's declaration? Well, this is where it gets interesting. The House Democrats were expecting at least, that one seat in the state would be moved in favor of the Democratic Party. And they were believing that it might be this 4th district, one that's currently held by a Republican but comprises a huge chunk of Salt Lake City. In fact, all of the districts do. But it was drawn in a way that in 2020, it was the 4th district that was in fact quite competitive. It certainly wasn't a Democratic district. Donald Trump won this district both times. But thinking about the fact that it was one that was at least somewhat within reach for Democrats made it so the rational thinking was that in the next election, if they were to redraw the map, this would be the Democratic Party's vote sink. But as is standard with Republicans in the redistricting process, they oftentimes try to make the maps even more favorable to the GOP than even the courts might have asked for. I already told you that the courts had declared essentially that Democrats must get a district here, but the Utah Republicans refused to do that. A lot of the times they try to stall and are often, held in contempt of court, but it really doesn't matter because this judge at most is only going to rule against them on the maps as they already have. And so the Utah Republicans are trying to pull a fast one on the Democrats and instead implement a new congressional map, the one that was on here, option C, that was proposed to the state before, that would ultimately create 4 Republican districts from the last cycle. So how is this a victory for the Democrats? Well, there's 2 ways that this could answer. On one end, the judge could say, this map doesn't make sense. I'm going to have the Democratic plaintiffs put forth their own map for the 2026 midterms. And if that is the case, that's probably best case scenario for the Democrats and potentially a very likely outcome, depending on what the Utah legislature decides to do. The other side of it is that based off this map, while it is 4 Republican seats, one of them is Trump plus 48, one of them is Trump plus 29, and then both of the remaining districts, Utah's 2nd and 3rd, spiral down to being Trump plus 7 and Trump plus 2. Now, if you don't see the danger in that, you should, because these districts would not be safe for the GOP in 2026, and by almost every metric, Democrats would be nearly guaranteed a pickup in Utah's 3rd, and potentially even in Utah's 2nd. Because the last time there was a Donald Trump midterm was in 2018, and the difference in vote share could not be more apparent. From 2016 to 2018, 75% of all House districts in the country shifted by a margin of over 15 points. A huge, huge advantage and change in favor of the Democratic Party from 2016 to 2018. Massive districts, huge areas, rural, suburban, and urban districts alike, all shifted towards the Democratic Party in monumental ways. And so thinking about what we expect in Utah, anything short or anything less than 7 points in a shift for the Democrats is completely unrealistic compared to how they did it in 2018, and chances are that both of these House districts the Republicans probably drew because they believed might hold on in a better year could ultimately end up going to the Democratic Party and giving them 2 out of the 4 seats in Utah. And now it has been a long time since Democrats have had the majority in the Utah, House of Representatives when it came down to elections. In 1992 was the last time, and 2 years later, it went back to the Republican Party. Democrats have never had a substantive advantage over Republicans in the state, and even a 2-2 map may not be that. But it is a far fall from grace for the Republican Party to go from a map that is 4-0 in favor of the GOP, ultimately reduced down to being 2-2. Democrats have not won Utah since the 1964 presidential election. So just the sheer idea here, the Democrats could be sharing total delegation numbers with the Republicans. And, this is arguably very much a red state, right? Donald Trump won the state by a very significant amount. This is not some, narrow margin that Democrats scraped by, or Republicans scraped by, rather, and are latching onto power. Obviously, right, a 4-0 gerrymander is wrong and unconstitutional based off what is outlined in Utah's constitution, or was before the Republicans decided to get rid of it. But ultimately speaking, Republicans probably should be holding 3 out of the 4 seats here if we're talking about a map that, makes sense and is proportionally right compared to how some of these other maps are drawn. But in the event that it is 2-2, Republicans would have nobody to blame but themselves. It's this idea that they are trying to directly defy the court order because they don't want to do anything that benefits the Democratic Party, but it might ultimately end up backfiring tremendously for the 2026 midterms, because it is not unrealistic by any metric to say that Democrats might win a Trump plus 7 district, but it is nearly a guarantee the Democrats would flip a Trump plus 2 district. Even coming off the last cycle, 2024, if you shift the national map by just 2 points, which would be the bare minimum under this new map to change the map in favor of the Democratic Party, you shift it by 2, you end up with Democrats in the majority. And so when you think about how easy that was, right, just the narrowest shift really goes to show that this map here, I think, is ultimately one of the worst that the Republicans could pass. They could easily make a compact district that complies with the court order. And I honestly thought maybe there would be some level of strong political instincts, given that Utah Republicans have dominated in the state for quite some time, that would tell them that they should draw a Democratic vote sink and 3 Republican districts, because we've seen it before across the country. Democrats and Republicans oftentimes do this in order to benefit their political party. I mean, it's not lost on us that there are a variety of states where Democrats and Republicans, for instance, South Carolina is a great example of how Republicans, who, only win about 60% of the vote in South Carolina, right? 58% in the last cycle. 58%, Kamala Harris at 40%, and yet in the overall House of Delegates breakdown, after the 2020 election, when Democrats came within competitive territory of the second, competitive territory of the first, and in 2018, came even closer, had 2 seats here, they drew it so it was a guarantee that all of the Democratic Party's vote share was either split across the board or compacted into Jim Clyburn's district, South Carolina's 6th, a margin here of 6 1. This is an example of what Utah Republicans could do in theory, but they might get greedy and go too far. And what ultimately could happen is the Democrats could go from 0 districts to 2. And the national implications of that, I think, cannot be understated. Republicans have already redrawn the state of Missouri to implement a new congressional map here, taking away Missouri's 5th district. But in Indiana, Republicans are considering drawing out that 1st district as well away from the Democrats, giving them just 1 seat in Indiana and Missouri. Given that Texas and California are likely to counteract each other, Missouri and Indiana, let's say Republicans successfully redraw Indiana and they lock in, and Utah is there and counteracts the gains that the Republicans had, all because the GOP got greedy about their positioning and their stances across the board. It really is laughable when you look at the map here and say, why is it that you drew the map in this way? Why is it that you decided all of a sudden that, despite the court order being very explicit, and I do think that there's a likelier case that the judge decides the legislature acted in contempt of court and said that, you are violating what I have decreed, what the Utah Supreme Court has agreed with must be upheld in the state. The legislature might find themselves where Democrats draw themselves a map that is more beneficial to the Democrats than even either of these two options. But it is greed, ultimately, that is resulting in Republicans in this position where Democrats might actually succeed on redistricting. It's one of the limited cases where a GOP Supreme Court has sided with the Democratic Party. The U.S. Supreme Court won't intervene. They don't take up congressional redistricting cases when it comes down to partisan gerrymandering. And so I really do believe that Republicans are, in a really tough place, where on one end, they would obviously love to have all 4 districts, but that's not going to be reality. So either they go for 2 out of the 4 and win 2 out of the 4 in a Democratic midterm, or they give up 1. There's an easy answer there, and there's a harder answer. But the GOP probably believes, and I think this is where you lose the political instincts on the moment, that it is going to be them who's different, that they are going to suddenly outpace Democrats and Republicans on the national stage, and that Utah will somehow be immune to a shift from the 2016 election. But if 2018 was a telling sign of anything, we will know that is not the case. Because comparing 2016 versus 2018, while the nation shifted by a larger amount, Utah's district, the ones that are being targeted by Democrats here, the 2nd district, which is one that is up for target for the GOP, Trump +7. This district in the last cycle, Democrats gained a net 10 points on the overall average. In Utah's 1st district, it was about 5 points, but in Utah's 3rd, more, right? And this is the district where you are going to find that you just need Trump +2 to change. And I think that's really what that struck me as the biggest liability here for the GOP, is that it doesn't take much, right? It isn't that it's going to be an Oklahoma 5th situation, which if you don't know the lore on that, I'll briefly show you. Oklahoma's 5th district was one that was on nobody's radar. It went to Russell by 20.3 in 2016. 2 years later, Kendra Horn defeats him by 1.4%. I mean, fascinating. The next year, 2 years later, rather, in 2020, Democrats lose the district, and then Republicans, of course, draw it into oblivion to make sure that it never, ever, ever happens again. But the point is that as it stands right now, based off this Utah map here, them going for an Oklahoma-style map has been their ultimate downfall. And while it may have given them 4-0 in the advantage in 2022 and 2024, which I actually made the case, and I think that this is a very compelling one about greed when it comes down to redrawing the maps here. You violate Proposition 4, you override what the voters want, you go back to the map here and draw it in a way that sure solidifies your victories in 2022 and 2024, but here's the catch, right? These were strong years for the GOP. In 2022, Republicans were winning back House control. If Democrats lost the map in 2020, they're certainly not winning it in 2022 or 2024. So the ultimate delegation would have been the exact same, and the reason why the judge is even taking up this case in the first place, why the Supreme Court sided with the Democrats, wasn't just that Republicans had the advantage. It's because it was an egregious enough gerrymander that they felt compelled to strike down the map. If they had maintained a 2020 era map, which voters, I'm sure, wanted to put forth, you would have ended up with no court case, no redrawing of the map, and Republicans holding the advantage, and maybe, just maybe, because in 2018 it almost didn't shift, maybe, just maybe, a Democrat in Utah, and now there might be 2. So we'll watch Utah. We'll see what happens. October 6th is right around the corner. And the decision that we will hear from the Utah judge will be quite apparent. And thinking about where it is right now, Republicans have absolutely nobody to blame but themselves for this redistricting debacle in Utah. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.